The summer Illy Calloway turned 17 was the summer the creek dried up for the first time in 40 years, the summer his mother packed 2 suitcases and drove west without leaving a note, and the summer he learned that the hardest thing a man can do is ask for help. He didn't know any of that at the start of it. At the start of it, he only knew the highway, the weight of a canvas duffel bag over one shoulder, and the particular kind of loneliness that settles into your chest like a stone when you've been walking for 3 hours and haven't seen a single car. He'd left Harlan County just before dawn, slipping out while his uncle was still asleep, or at least pretending to be. Uncle Terence wasn't a bad man, not exactly, but he was a bottle, and the evening man, a don't talk to me before noon man, and lately he'd become something else too, something with a shorter fuse and louder voice, something that made Illy prefer the open road to the kitchen table. The duffel held 2 shirts, a pair of jeans, his father's old pocketknife, and $43 he'd earned hauling brush for the Milner farm. He figured $43 could get him somewhere. He hadn't decided where somewhere was yet. The road he was on cut through scrubland and the occasional stand of post oaks, and the July heat was the kind that doesn't apologize for itself. By 9 in the morning it was already pressing down on him like a hand on the back of his neck. Sweat darkened the collar of his shirt. His sneakers, which had a split along the right sole, let in a little puff of dust with every step, which he supposed was some ventilation at least. He kept his eyes on the road ahead and tried not to think about how thirsty he was, or how the 2 granola bars in his bag were already probably soft and crumbling in the heat. He'd gone maybe another mile when he heard the truck. It came from behind him, slowing as it drew near, a big dusty Ford the color of old rust with a stock trailer rattling along behind it. The truck pulled onto the gravel shoulder and stopped about 20 feet ahead of him, and the driver's window came down. The man who leaned out had a face like a topographic map, all ridgelines and weathered valleys, with a gray mustache that drooped at the corners and a sweat-stained hat the color of creek sand. He looked at Illy the way an experienced person looks at a situation before deciding what it is. "You breaking down or running away?" The man called out. Illy stopped walking. He considered lying, which was his first instinct, and then decided against it, which was new for him. "Neither," he said, "just going." The man seemed to find this acceptable. Where to? Haven't settled on that yet. The man chewed on this for a moment, or maybe he was chewing on something else. It was hard to say. Then he said, "I'm going as far as Mule Creek Junction. You're welcome to the passenger seat if you don't talk too much, and you're not carrying anything that'll get me in trouble." Illy held up the duffel bag, "Just clothes and a pocketknife. Get in." The inside of the truck smelled like leather and diesel and something faintly medicinal, like liniment or saddle soap. The seat had a crack down the middle patched with duct tape. On the dash there was a faded photograph tucked behind the defroster vents. A woman in a yellow dress standing in front of a barn, squinting into the sun and smiling. There was a pair of spurs hanging from the rearview mirror, clinking softly as the truck pulled back onto the highway. The man drove without speaking, which suited Illy fine. He watched the scrubland go by and drank from a water bottle the man had wordlessly passed him before they'd gone half a mile, and tried to think about nothing at all. He did not succeed. His mind kept circling back to the note he hadn't found on the kitchen table 3 days ago, and the one he hadn't found on his mother's dresser, and the fact that her car was simply gone when he came downstairs that morning. No fight, no warning, no reason he could put his finger on, though later he would think about the way she'd been sitting on the porch some evenings just staring at the horizon with an expression he hadn't had a word for then. He had a word for it now. Gone already. She'd had the look of someone who was gone. already long before she actually left. "You got people somewhere?" the man asked, about 30 miles in. "Not exactly." The man didn't push. He just nodded, like "not exactly" was a perfectly reasonable answer, which maybe it was. Another 10 miles passed. A hawk sat on a fence post and watched them go by with royal indifference. "My name's Walt Prout," the man said finally. "Illy Calloway." "You eat today, Illy Calloway." "Had some crackers earlier." Walt Prout made a sound that was not quite disapproval and not quite sympathy, somewhere in between. He reached behind the seat without looking and produced a brown paper bag that he dropped in Illy's lap. Inside was a foil, wrapped biscuit with sausage, still faintly warm. Illy looked at it for a second and then ate it in about 4 bites, which he was a little embarrassed about. But Walt Prout kept his eyes on the road and didn't comment. Mule Creek Junction turned out to be less of a junction and more of a wide spot in the road with a gas station, a feed store, and a diner called Patsy's that had a hand-painted sign in the window advertising pie. Walt pulled into the gas station and cut the engine and sat there a moment. "End of the line for me," he said. "I'm turning north here." He paused. "You got somewhere to sleep tonight?" Illy looked out at Mule Creek Junction, which didn't look like it had many options in the sleeping department. "I'll figure something out." Walt pulled the key from the ignition and turned it over in his fingers. "You know," he said, and his voice shifted slightly, became less road, casual and more deliberate. "I was 17 once too. Ran off in the summer, thought I was getting somewhere. Ended up in a ditch in New Mexico eating gas station jerky for 3 days. He looked at Illy sideways. "There's no glory in hardship for its own sake, son. Hard times come for you whether you go looking or not. No need to go meet them halfway." Illy said nothing. He looked at the dashboard photograph, the woman in yellow. Walt noticed. "My wife," he said. "Eleanor. She passed 8 years ago." He said it simply, without performance, the way you say something you've made peace with, even if you haven't stopped missing it. "She was the one who found me, matter of fact, in that New Mexico ditch. Well, not her specifically, but a woman like her. Sent me to her father, who put me to work on his ranch. That's how I learned everything worth knowing." He settled the key in his palm. "I'm telling you this because somebody told me something like it once, and I didn't listen, but it planted a seed." He reached into the glove box and produced a small card, handwritten, with a name and a phone number. "That's my neighbor, Dale Briggs. He runs cattle outside of a town called Persimmon, about 40 miles east of here. He owes me a favor, and more to the point, he's a good man who can use a hand if you're willing to work. You're willing to work." Illy took the card. "Yes, sir. You know anything about cattle?" "I know some. Horses. A little." Walt nodded, like a little was a start. "You call that number. You tell him Walt Prout sent you. He'll feed you and give you a place to sleep, and he'll work you half to death. But it'll be honest work, and he won't raise a hand to you." He looked at Illy directly then, and something in the look made Illy feel that Walt Prout understood a thing or two about raised hands without having been told about them. "You hear me?" "Yes, sir." Walt got out to pump his gas. Illy sat in the truck holding the card. After a moment he got out too, and stood in the full sun, and looked east, where the highway went toward a place called Persimmon. Then he went into the gas station and asked to use their phone. Dale Briggs answered on the second ring, and his voice was like gravel and good humor mixed together. And he said if Walt sent you then come on, and told Illy there was a bus that ran east through Mule Creek Junction at 2 in the afternoon, and let him off right on the county road by the ranch. Illy thanked him and hung up and went across to Patsy's and had a piece of peach pie for $2.50 and watched the clock until 2. The bus was an old regional line with air conditioning that worked sometimes and a driver who listened to gospel music quietly, on a portable radio. Illy got off at the county road as instructed and stood in the heat for maybe 5 minutes before a truck came down the ranch road to collect him, driven by a teenage boy about Illy's age with a sunburned nose and an easy manner. "You Illy?" The boy said. "Yeah. I'm Cody Briggs. My dad sent me." He reached over and opened the passenger door without getting out. "Throw your stuff in the back." The Briggs Ranch was called the Double B, and it sat in a shallow valley between two low ridges covered in cedar and scrub oak. The main house was stone and wood, old but solid, with a porch that wrapped around two sides and a roof that meant business. There was a barn, several outbuildings, a set of working pens with freshly oiled gates, and everywhere the smell of hay and horse, and the particular mineral smell of well water. Dogs of mixed and ambiguous breed came out to investigate the truck with their tails going. Dale Briggs was standing on the porch. He was a big man, not fat but square, with shoulders that suggested a history of hard labor and a face that suggested a history of weather. He wore boots and jeans and a shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and when he shook Illy's hand, his grip was certain but not showy. "Walt says you're looking for work and you're willing." Dale said, "Yes, sir. That's enough for me to start." He looked Illy over with the same kind of experienced assessment Walt had used, not unkind, just thorough. "You look like you haven't slept right in a while." Illy almost said he was fine, which was what he always said. Instead he just nodded. "Well," Dale said, "work starts at 6. Tonight you eat and sleep. Come on in." The inside of the house was worn and comfortable, the kind of comfortable that takes decades to achieve, with a big kitchen that smelled of something savory on the stove, and a table long enough for 8 that currently held the various remains of an afternoon's worth of paperwork. A woman came out of the back hallway, small and precise in her movements, with dark hair shot through with silver and an expression of calm capability. "This is my wife, June," Dale said. June Briggs shook his hand too and looked at him with eyes that missed nothing. "Hungry?" she said. "Yes, ma'am." She didn't make a fuss about it. She just pointed him to a chair and put a bowl of beef stew in front of him with cornbread on the side, and he ate with the concentrated gratitude of someone who has been uncertain about meals, and she refilled his bowl without asking. After dinner, Cody showed him the bunkhouse, a small building near the barn with 4 bunks, a wood stove, a shelf of dog-geared paperbacks, and a window that looked out at the ridge. 2 of the bunks were occupied by ranch hands, brothers named Hector and Tomaz, who nodded at him without ceremony and went back to their card game. His bunk had clean sheets that smelled like line drying and a wool blanket folded at the foot. He sat on the edge of it and took off his split-soled sneakers and set them on the floor and looked at them. They looked like what they were, a kid's sneakers, wrong for this place, wrong for this work. He put them under the bunk and lay down on top of the covers without undressing because he didn't quite feel like he'd earned the comfort of getting into bed yet. Not his first night, not in someone else's place. He lay there looking at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the ranch at night, which were different from the sounds of town, fuller and older somehow, frogs and crickets, and the occasional low commentary from the cattle in the near pasture, and somewhere an owl making its slow inquiry of the dark. He thought about his mother. He thought about the highway. He thought about Walt Prute's wife in her yellow dress, squinting into the sun. He fell asleep before he meant to. The next weeks were the hardest and the most clarifying of his life. Dale Briggs, it turned out, had not been exaggerating when he said he could use a hand, and work at the Double B began in the blue-gray of early morning and didn't end until the sun was well past the midpoint of the sky, and sometimes not even then. Illy mended fence, filled water tanks, moved cattle between pastures, learned to use a come, a long and a post pounder and a sorting stick. He learned how to read a cow's intentions from the angle of her head, and how to move through a herd without spooking it. He learned that horses were individuals with opinions, and that the best way to handle an opinion you disagreed with was patience, not force. He was not good at most of this at first. He was slow and made mistakes that Hector and Tamaz were generous enough not to comment on. And once he let a gate chain slip at the wrong moment and had to spend an hour and a half in the afternoon heat helping round up 8 cows that scattered into the cedar breaks, sweating through his shirt and receiving only laconic guidance from Dale, who never once raised his voice. That evening at dinner Dale said, "You'll remember that gate," and Illy said, "Yes, sir," and that was the end of it. What surprised him most about Dale Briggs was the silence, not the hostile silence of a man withholding something, but the comfortable silence of a man who didn't feel the need to fill the air. They could work side by side for 2 hours without speaking, and it wasn't uncomfortable. But when Dale did speak, it was worth hearing. He had the habit of saying things once, plainly, and trusting you to carry them. Cody was a different kind of teacher. He was talkative where his father was quiet, quick to laugh, generous with information about the ranch and the animals and the particular geography of the valley. He'd grown up on this land and knew it the way you know something you've never been without, not as knowledge exactly, but as a kind of fluency. He and Illy fell into an easy rhythm, the way boys sometimes do when they're both working toward the same thing and neither of them has anything to prove. It was Cody who first noticed that Illy slept in his work boots. They'd come in late from a fence repair job, tired and dusty, and Illy had dropped onto his bunk without ceremony, boots still on, and was asleep in minutes. In the morning, Cody didn't say anything. But 2 nights later it happened again, and this time Hector noticed too, and in the morning Hector mentioned it to Dale with the neutral reporting style of a man who is not making a judgment but thinks the information might be relevant. That evening, after the day's work was done and supper had been cleared, Dale came out to the bunkhouse. He knocked, which he didn't always do, and came in and sat on the old wooden chair by the wood stove. Illy was on his bunk reading one of the paperbacks, which had a faded Western on the cover. Hector and Tamaz had gone to their cousin's place for the evening. Cody was in the main house. Dale sat there for a moment in his natural silence, which Illy had learned to read by now. This was a thinking, about what to say silence, not a waiting, for you to go. First silence, "You sleeping all right?" Dale said. "Fine," Illy said, and then remembered what he'd decided about lying. "Mostly fine." Dale nodded. He looked at Illy's boots, which Illy was currently wearing, even though it was 8 o'clock in the evening and he'd been back from the work for 3 hours. "You know," Dale said, "I've been doing this long enough to know that a man who sleeps in his boots generally doesn't feel like wherever he's laying his head belongs to him enough to take them off." Illy looked at the boots. He didn't say anything, like he might need to move quick. Dale said, like he might need to go. The frogs were going outside. The cattle made their nighttime sounds. "I'm not going anywhere," Illy said. "I know that." Dale said, "I'm not saying you are. I'm saying your boots don't know that yet." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, looking at the floor between his own feet. "I grew up in a house where you had to be ready. I know what that feels like in your body. Like you can't afford to fully land somewhere, because if you land somewhere and then it goes wrong, it's worse than if you never landed at all." He looked up, at the shape of it. Illy's throat felt tight. "Something like that. Your people," Dale said carefully, are they looking for you? My uncle probably knows I'm gone. He won't look hard." Illy paused. "My mom left a few weeks before I did. I don't know where she went." Dale was quiet with that for a moment, giving it the weight it deserved. "I'm sorry," he said. He didn't say it the way people say it when they don't know what else to say. He said it the way people say it when they mean it precisely. "It's all right," Illy said, which was not true, but was the only thing he knew how to say. Dale looked at him. "It's not all right. It's just something you're getting through." He stood up, and for a moment he just stood there, this big square man in the small bunkhouse, and his presence was the kind that didn't take up space aggressively, but simply occupied it. Like something that belongs where it is. "I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it right." Illy looked at him. "This bunkhouse is yours as long as you're working here. The work is yours as long as you want it. June and we're not going anywhere. Cody's not going anywhere. Hector and Tomas have been here 6 years." He held Illy's gaze steady. "This isn't charity and it isn't pity. You've earned your place here already, 3 times over. Any rancher worth his salt would tell you that. But earning it doesn't mean you have to stay braced for it to disappear." Illy nodded. His jaw was doing something complicated. "You can rest here, son," Dale said. "That's what I'm telling you. You can take your boots off." He didn't touch Illy's shoulder or make any gesture toward him. He just said the words and let them stand. Then he turned and went to the door. "Good night," he said, and went out. Illy sat with it for a while, the frogs, the cattle, the owl. Then he reached down and unlaced his right boot and pulled it off and set it on the floor. Then he did the left. He set them side by side under the bunk, like his sneakers had been that first night, and he lay back and looked at the ceiling in his socks. It sounds like a small thing. It felt like something else entirely. He woke up at 5:30 the next morning, before his alarm, feeling like he'd slept deeply for the first time in months, maybe longer. He lay there in the gray Prairie, and looked at the ceiling and then at the window where the light was just beginning to build, and something had shifted in a way he couldn't entirely name. Like a muscle that had been clenched for so long he'd forgotten it was clenched had finally, in the night, slowly let go. He got up and laced his boots on and went to work, and it was the same work it had always been, the water tanks and the fence and the cattle with their opinions, but he moved through it differently. That day, not looser exactly, but less braced, more present somehow. He didn't talk to Dale about it, and Dale didn't bring it up. That was the thing about Dale Briggs. He gave you what you needed and then got out of the way of it. Let it do its work in your own time. The weeks moved through their shapes, and Illy learned the ranch with a growing fluency of his own. He got better with the horses. He got faster at the fence work. He learned to read the weather coming off the West Ridge in the afternoon and to move cattle accordingly. Hector taught him some Spanish and Tomas taught him to make tortillas, and Cody taught him which of the county road's cattle guards could be crossed at speed without shaking your teeth loose. June Briggs taught him, without ever directly saying she was teaching him anything, that a good meal is an act of care, that keeping a space clean is a form of respect for whoever lives in it, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do for a person is sit across from them and be quiet and present while they work something out. His mother called, eventually. It was a Saturday in early September, the air finally beginning to have a hint of something other than heat in it. Illy was on the porch of the bunkhouse reading when June came out from the main house and said there was a phone call for him. His mother was in Arizona. She didn't explain why, or at least not in any way that added up to an explanation. She said she was sorry. She said she'd been in a bad place. She said she was getting some help now. She said she loved him. He stood in the Briggs's kitchen with the phone pressed to his ear and the afternoon light coming in through the window over the sink, and said yes, and I know, and okay, and yes. He did not say, "I know you love me, but you left without a word, and I was 17 and alone in my uncle's house, which had been getting smaller and louder every week. He didn't say that yet. That was something for a different conversation, a conversation that would need building up to, that would maybe take years to have fully. What he said, at the end, was, "I'm okay, Mom. I found a good place." He hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment, and then June Briggs was there, doing something completely natural and unintrusive at the counter, not having gone anywhere because that was the kind of woman she was. You were simply less alone when she was in her room, and she said, without turning around, "You want some coffee?" "Yes, ma'am," he said, and sat down at the long table. In October, Dale asked him if he wanted to stay through the winter. He said they'd pay him properly, not just room and board. He said he could keep his bunk, and if he wanted to finish his schooling, there was a situation they could probably work out with the county. He said it simply, like an offer between equals, not like charity, not like rescue. Illy said yes. He said it without hedging, without the old instinct to keep one foot pointed toward the door. He said yes and meant the whole thing, the winter and the school and the bunk and the particular life that had formed itself around him here in this valley, which he had not chosen exactly or not consciously, but which had been waiting in a certain sense, the way some things are waiting, requiring only that you stop moving long enough to let them find you. That evening he came back to the bunkhouse after supper and sat on the edge of his bunk and took off his boots the way he'd been doing for 2 months now, and set them neatly underneath, and lay back on top of the covers looking at the ceiling, which he had memorized by now, every knot and crack in the planks. He thought about Walt Prout, and the road and the water bottle passed without ceremony, and the card pulled from a glove box. He thought about how things are connected in ways you can't see while you're inside them, how a decision on a highway at dawn could lead to a kitchen table and a bowl of stew and a bunkhouse with a wool blanket folded at the foot of the bunk. He thought about Dale Briggs sitting in that chair by the cold wood stove saying, "You can rest here, son," and the way those words had done something to him that he was still processing, that he suspected he would be processing for a long time. He was still his mother's son. He was still the boy from Harlan County. He was still the person who'd learned to sleep in his boots, to be ready to move, to never quite land anywhere. Those things were in him and would always be in him, parts of what he was made of, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But they didn't have to be the loudest parts. They didn't have to run the whole operation. A man who sleeps in his boots generally doesn't feel like wherever he's laying his head belongs to him enough to take them off. Dale had said that. It was true, and its reverse was also true. The act of taking them off was itself a choice, a small repeated declaration that this place is mine to be in, that I am allowed to rest, that rest is not weakness and staying is not a trap. It was a thing you had to learn. Nobody was born knowing it. He heard Hector and Tomas come in, their familiar voices and the shuffle of their evening routine, and then the light went out and the sounds of the ranch came through the window, and the owl started in on its question, and somewhere in the dark the cattle were resting in the grass without worrying about the night, which was their great and wordless wisdom, and Illy lay in his bunk without his boots on and let himself rest. He was 17 years old in a valley between 2 cedar ridges in the middle of a place that was becoming, slowly and surely, and in the way that real things happen, his. The boots were under the bunk. The night was long and gentle. Somewhere his mother was in Arizona figuring out how to live, and somewhere on a highway Walt Prout was driving north with spurs on his rear view mirror and a photograph of a woman in yellow tucked behind the vents, and somewhere Harlan County was sitting in its own heat, not thinking about him at all. But here he was, in the place between places where tired things finally come to lay their weight down, and the weight was laying down, and the ground was holding it. He slept without his boots on and did not dream of leaving, And in the morning the work was there, which was the same as saying the life was there, and he rose into it.